Hi there, my name is Linda LaNoue, and I am the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, or DEI Director for the 2024 Board of Directors of JCI Michigan, previously known as the Junior Chamber International. We have here today Gabe Murillo, founder of Enjoy Talent, and 2023 DEI Director for JCI Michigan, as well as Michelle McGrann, current JCI Michigan President and International Facilitator. We're going to be discussing bystander intervention today. And just as a little background, Gabe has been working in the DE&I space for over a decade. Gabe has designed and implemented DE&I programs for local, state, and national nonprofits, large public universities, state and local governments, startups, and large public tech firms. As an organization, JCI Michigan has discussed bystander intervention in the past, including for the February year-end conference for 2023 in Mount Pleasant, and today's discussion will continue to build on these topics. At a high level, bystander intervention is defined as a response to a situation that may be harmful to someone else. It involves recognizing the potential for harm and taking action to reduce it. Prevention and de-escalation are core tenets of bystander intervention. Both of these skills can be difficult to practice when it comes to potentially violent situations, and we're here today to walk through ways that we can create more safe spaces and safe atmospheres in our communities. So a few of the main steps for bystander intervention include, again, from a high level, observing, assessing, and interpreting a situation in order to notice whether there is a problem. That's a critical first step. A feeling of responsibility to see yourself as part of the solution and being able to help is a second step. And then knowing what to do, with safety being the most important consideration when intervening. There are a few different approaches, including an ABC approach, which A stands for assessing for safety. If you see someone in trouble, ask yourself if you can help safely in any way. Remember, your personal safety is a priority and to never put yourself at risk. Being in a group is another way to know what to do. That's what the B stands for. It's safer to call out a behavior or intervene when you're in a group. If this isn't an option, then you can report it to others who can act. And C is caring for the victim, talking to the person who you think may need help and asking them if they're okay. If you are safe, there are several other approaches that you can take, including being direct, addressing problematic behavior head on, distracting, being creative and doing something unexpected to disrupt the situation, documenting, recording what you witnessed as soon as possible, delegating to alert others who can help and asking for their assistance, and then delaying, pausing so that you can allow yourself to figure out what the best course of action is. And being intentional is very important. And it's also normal to freeze in moments of uncertainty. And so while bystander intervention can be applied in many contexts, to support the experiences of our JCI Michigan members and local chapters, today we'll be focusing on bystander intervention in the context of public encounters, civic engagement, and volunteering with larger groups of people. And so the first question is for Gabe, and it is, how would I notice a potentially harmful act? For example, if I see something that seems like it could be an issue, yet it also seems like I might be overreaching to interpret it as a problem, much less take action, how do I know when to intervene?
Great, thank you. So first, thank you, Linda and Michelle, for having me. It's a pleasure to be back talking to JCI Michigan about something I feel very passionate about, which is bystander intervention. And I love starting with this twofold question that you have here, because I think it's super important to kind of frame the discussion that we're having. So I think the first thing to recognize is that the first part of this question, how do I notice a potentially harmful act? I think this is super important in the assessment stage that you previously talked about, which I think is really important. But I also think that a lot of our kind of insecurities about knowing when to act are more tightly related to what I call decision phobia. So it's basically the idea that we're afraid to make a decision, we're afraid to make change, so we make no decision. And something that will be a consistent theme for me throughout this talk is a reminder that no decision is also a decision. So ultimately, when it comes to bystander intervention, you're not avoiding a decision by not acting, you're just deciding in a different way. So then ultimately, then the question is, how do I make the decision that it's justified to intervene? And I think the first thing to think about there is assessment of the situation. And I think there's a couple ways to assess the situation that are super, super important. The first is to check for bias. A lot of times, we can feel emotional when it comes to people, interpersonal relationships, et cetera. So when we're assessing, should I intervene? I think you want to make sure that you're not making a biased approach. So for example, is this purely stranger danger? Is it because I don't know this person that I'm feeling intimidated by them? Am I not giving them a fair chance? Or perhaps in terms of your relationship with the target of the action, is it somebody I'm overprotective of? Is it somebody that I really care about? Or perhaps the perpetuator, is this someone that really grinds my gears? Did I just have a fight with this person? Is there some long-standing grudge? So I think once you make it clear that this decision is rational, that it is based in a certain amount of logic and not purely emotional, you can feel more comfortable in trusting your gut there. The second step, as you mentioned in the summary, I think the points that you've summarized are really great. And I do want to highlight that there'll be resources that outline all of these points, and they're super, super helpful. Check for safety. So are you worried about intervening because this is an unsafe environment? Could your intervention potentially make the situation worse? And if you kind of pass that safety check, then that's another way that you can kind of push past that decision phobia. The third thing is to really read the room. So if you're trying to decide, is this something I'm feeling, or is this something that the target of, say, harassment or bullying is feeling? I think there are several things you can do. The first is to read nonverbals. Is the target closing up? Are they becoming smaller? Are they moving away from the situation? Those are all signs that somebody is uncomfortable, and you can feel more confident in your assessment if you feel, okay, this person's also uncomfortable. I feel like I can intervene. The second thing is to view the nonverbals of the perpetuator. Are they getting bigger? Are they getting closer? I guess this is a verbal, but are they getting louder? Is another thing to think about. So kind of reading the room and that assessment. A second level to assessment that people don't talk about quite as much as nonverbals is eye contact. Humans are able to communicate a lot non-verbally just through eye contact. So if you're worried about the target of what you perceive as harassment or something to intervene, make eye contact with them. Are they saying, help, I need help, I'm uncomfortable, I'm in a weird situation, please notice that I'm looking at you? Or are they saying, hey, weirdo, why are you staring at me? And so eye contact is really big. And the opposite of that as well is eye contact with the perpetuator, saying, hey, I'm watching you. Like when we lock eyes, that someone else is observing the situation. In that sense, you've already intervened just by kind of making that eye contact and communicating. I'm thinking about taking further action here. I'm watching you. You're making me uncomfortable, et cetera. So reading the room in terms of nonverbals and eye contact, the type of words that are being said, how other people are reacting, can all give you confidence in your decision to intervene. And the last, go ahead,
Go
Michelle.
ahead.
Thank you.
Well, I was just going to add one point to kind of to your first point in terms of, decision paralysis. In a lot of the instances that we deal with in JCI Michigan and sort of in these particular contexts, it is more related to harassment or bullying and that type of thing. If you choose to intervene and the person does not feel like they're being harassed or bullied, there's no loss, right? Like there's no impact to that. You tried to step in and they said, they laughed and said, we're friends, or we're joking, or like, I don't feel unsafe in this situation, then you're no harm, right? There's only harm the other way. And so it's a little bit of reassurance. If you're kind of on that border and you're seeing maybe mixed signals of, you know, what Gabe's talking about, stepping in is not going to be harmful if you're wrong. You can only be helpful if you're right.
Michelle, I really appreciate that point. As someone who tends to, I've seen both sides, and so I think that's a really important part for discerning how to step in. Because in my mind, I still haven't seen explicitly what you've said. I've seen people, you know, make these really awkward situations, but I think that when it comes to harm and the potential for harm, you, like you said, you can only help a situation or potentially diffuse something that, you know, it wouldn't matter for you to intervene.
Right.
Yeah, Michelle, I think that's an awesome point. It dovetails with, I'm going to come back to decision phobia, decision paralysis a little bit later, and that is, you've already previewed one of the major points of that, which is kind of how to make that decision and kind of weighing that decision. And I think that's really important. I also think that ties in a lot with the last kind of thing that I'd like to say on this question, and that's to focus on tactics. I think a lot of times when it comes to bystander intervention, we are focused on the strategy of bystander intervention. And that's a lot for one person to shoulder, because ultimately the strategy of bystander intervention is to eliminate harm from social spaces. And that's not going to happen in one kind of encounter. So you can feel burdened to act if you don't think you can do that. However, the tactics of bystander intervention are a lot easier to think through. So if we think about those 5 Ds that you listed before, and I know Michelle will understand the reference to our college days in the debate team, our rule book was called the 5 Ds. So I loved seeing that in here. Obviously different words, but was still a funny connection there. There are several tactics that we can take in bystander intervention to reduce harm. So is this a situation where I can merely distract and the only potential harm there is I might look foolish? Then that's much easier to swallow than if I think, okay, am I going to be direct here and say, hey, you're doing this, I don't like it, you have to stop? That's, you know, only one of several tactics that we can take. So when assessing a situation, just, you know, distraction, even delay, you know, it is a form of bystander intervention to say, I'm not 100% confident this person needs my intervention, but I'm 100% confident I need to have a conversation with this person to check in and say, hey, I felt a little bit weird in this situation. I want to understand if I was reading the room correctly. And secondarily, in the future, how can I act to make sure that you feel the safest in those situations? And again, there's no harm to that conversation. So I think when we're thinking of how do I notice a potentially harmful act, to kind of get back to that from the abstracts, it's have a system of assessment and then trust your gut. If you're being thorough at assessing situations, then you can trust your gut, and also realize that sometimes the buy-in is really small. Sometimes the buy-in is going in and making a horrible joke just to distract the situation, or asking somebody to, you know, let's say you're volunteering. You can say, hey, we need you back at the volunteer booth. Can you come with me? Those very low impact, kind of low risk situations that can have a huge impact at harm reduction. And for the second part of the question, I do want to kind of focus on one thing here, which is what are the examples or kind of the context of an emergency? And I want to encourage that, I always encourage people that we should move away from the emergency framing. In all reality, bystander intervention isn't about emergencies. It's about the banal. It's about the day-to-day. It's about the things that aren't going to, you know, lead to someone getting stabbed or murdered or robbed, or, and, you know, there's not a fire to put out or any of those things. So ultimately, I think we shouldn't be looking for the emergencies. We should be looking for the things that most people just kind of let go, the jokes, the pushing, the, pushing out of a space, those kind of things, the bullying. So in fact, I think emergencies aren't what we're looking for. We're looking for harm. And are there ways that we can reduce that harm? And we're looking for exclusivity. And are there ways that we can reverse that? So I think that, it doesn't have to be an emergency. And if it is an emergency, then we're going to move right to that delegate, because we're not, unless you're a CERT member or CERT, some sort of certification in dealing with violence or emergencies, that's not, we're not aligned. Yeah. So delegation, there's a reason delegation is in there, and that's because but bystander intervention isn't a call for martyrdom. It isn't a call to, put your life in front of, or put other people's lives in front of yours. It's about harm reduction, and can we take simple steps to reduce those harms? So don't be looking for emergencies before intervening. Look for harm. And if you think there's harm, that's sufficient reason to step in. So that harm can look like anything from bullying, joking, pushing out of a community, pushing out of a group. Just anytime someone is overwhelmed in a social situation, there could be harm there. So that's what we should be focusing on. And then we should be focusing on the variety of tactics that we have to address those harms, as opposed to the kind of existential crisis of solving all by harm elimination versus harm reduction.
Gabe, you made so many good points. I just need to reflect some of them back to you. And I also want to say, in terms of the word emergency, for the audience, that was in our notes that I sent to them, and I didn't say it out loud in the question. I think because maybe at a subconscious level, I knew that was an extreme way of thinking. However, it is how I was thinking when I wrote the notes. And I think as I was looking into this topic, a lot of things center around that. So I really appreciate you distinguishing that it's not about waiting until something extreme or thinking that as a bystander that you could really help in that situation, but all of the moments in our daily lives that we can help. And I think I really appreciate how you framed its tactics versus strategy. And ultimately, I think members of JCI Michigan, and a big part of the ethos of our group engagement is that, the having the interactions with people that are working toward that strategy to reduce harm and improve the quality of life and help, as a whole, people feel better in their communities. But that the whole, one of the beautiful things about being a member of JCI is that we're doing that together. So in the moments where maybe we're seeing things and we're either in our group or we're in our personal lives, that we can use some of those tactics. I think it's so helpful to learn about that and understand the nuance of that. I also was thinking about how so much of this is a function of caring for one another. And Michelle, in your example of, the opportunity to engage in, like, what's the worst case scenario if you do step in, it was reminding me of the benefits of group engagement and socialization and having chances to encounter things that maybe you don't have any other chance in another, any other part of your life to do. And those are some of the things I really appreciate about JCI Michigan.
Well, and it makes me think of it because I have been in a position in which somebody acted in a, intervened in a situation that I was having with someone else, that they had read that I was upset. And I wasn't, it was something else going on. And I, just the acknowledgement that they were concerned and that they were willing to step in made me feel cared for. And because it was unnecessary and, it became funny, and it's a joke between the three of us. So just for some context setting, I years ago, was going to follow a chapter president, and I had said, I will be on your board and then I'll probably run next year. And I had the opportunity to take a position at JCI Michigan. I felt very bad, right? Like I had felt that I had made a commitment to this person. So I went outside, and explained, I had this opportunity, but I promised you first. And I was feeling bad. And it was Friday night of conference, and I may have had a drink. And I started crying because, this is my friend and I'm feeling emotional. I'm worried I'm going to let him down. Someone else saw me. Oh, he said, would it make you feel better if instead of quitting, I fired you? I'm going to fire you so you don't have to feel bad at all. And you can take this, next opportunity because I think it's better for you. And I'm proud of you. And I teared up because it was emotional. Somebody outside heard him say, well, then I'll fire you, and me crying. Right. And so they're like, what are you doing? Why'd you make her cry? And kind of did that direct intervention. And all of us were like, no, that's not it. Right. It was silly. There was no harm. But at the same time, as you're saying, it was a demonstration of care. So whether or not I needed it, it made me feel better and closer to the person who intervened, even when it was unnecessary. And that's why I say, when we're talking about this decision making, in many cases, there's not harm. Gabe and I have been friends for 2 decades. Sad to say we're that old. We've been friends for 2 decades. He basically family, right? We also met on the debate team. So when we get going, our way of interacting with each other is debating, and it's a game for us. Now, somebody on the outside may see that we are butting heads and there's anger. You don't understand the whole, 20-year relationship and background, right? But that's okay. If somebody had intervened, again, not a problem. We would laugh it off and say everything's okay. Fear in that decision making in many cases is internal to the other person. And the more that we normalize that it's okay, the more that fear gets reduced. And so people feel more confident stepping in those times in which it's necessary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I really appreciate that. And the specific examples are really helpful too. I'm thinking about this quote I've heard, that you don't have to agree with someone to care for them. And I think about, how in our group engagement and things like that, another point just to highlight, Gabe, that you were saying, taking into account bias that we may have and what's prompting us to want to do things, and just working on being more cognizant of those aspects of the encounters that we're having, I think will really help. So the next question that we have is related to practicing being a more active community member and ensuring safety when doing so. So the question is, in what ways can someone take personal responsibility? How could I help? And I think that you've highlighted many things, but if you have more to add to this, that would be great.
I think one of the main things is just that awareness piece, of what is going on around you. Very often we get almost blinders in terms of, that's happening over there. That's not my problem, right? Not my circus, not my monkeys is kind of the phrase used a lot. But just because, it may be happening, I'm thinking conference at a different table, or you think that it's, inner chapter, that there's some sort of group and I don't know what's going, that we're all members, we're all people, and we all have a certain level of responsibility to each other to make sure that people feel comfortable, that people feel safe. And I know that Gabe is going to go far more into tactics, but it's simple as pulling someone aside and saying, hey, I saw on social media about your newest project. We were thinking of doing something similar. Can you tell me about it? There are ways to go and approach somebody maybe that you don't even know that well, but we share something enough that can be used as a way to intervene. And the relationship of we're all members together, we're all not even, and I don't really care if you're a member or not, we are part of a larger community, that we are all people, and there's no harm in pulling someone away from a conversation. to give them the opportunity to separate themselves from a situation that may just be awkward. You know what I mean? And like, they can choose after the fact to go back if it wasn't awkward or something. But again, it kind of goes down into that no harm, no foul. But you can't do that if you're not aware of your surroundings and sort of what else is going on. There's also a certain level of awareness of paying attention or noting certain maybe relationships, both good and bad, you know, kind of referencing back in terms of, you know, using Gabe and I as an example, right? An awareness that, hey, if they've been friends for 20 years, chances are like they can handle it themselves to a certain extent. There's probably like a closer relationship going on versus looking at people with very high power dynamics, you know, who there may not be an awareness, they may not know each other well, but, you know, if somebody has a position of power or a perceived position of power, talking down or, you know, being strong and like that nonverbal with like a newer member who may not feel as though they can speak up, that's a time to pay attention. You know, and we're human, you know, you can pay attention without, you can stare at them, but maybe part of the assessment is just kind of half listening or, you know, looking for those signs that Gabe outlined earlier. But power dynamics are a big one, and positioning. If you see somebody pulled aside into a room away from other people, and it's already kind of giving you some red flaggy, whether it be power dynamics or you know that there's a conflict or something, that may be a time to half listen or accidentally come in the room looking for something to give a person a way out, because anytime that someone is trying to be isolated, there's generally a reason. And sometimes it's not a bad reason. Maybe you know, we're doing a surprise for someone in the chapter or something like that, right? And it's a good thing, but that should be maybe where you take a little bit more awareness, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I love to follow up. My answer to that was a lot aligned with what Michelle just said, and that's really that the understanding that what we want to be bystander interventions because we want to make our community better. So the way that you take responsibility is by being dedicated to creating positive change within your community. And that's kind of the responsibility that you take. And from there, you learn the tactics and how to especially do that. So I think by big thing is to be present and to be aware in your community. So to be observant, to look at things kind of right beneath the surface, like power dynamics, how those relationships work out, leadership versus new members in the community. Is there fair integration? Are there power dynamics there? What's going on? So I think just the best way to take personal responsibility as a bystander intervention is to take responsibility for positive change in your community and be aware where the barriers to that change is and where you can help. Now, that kind of observance and that awareness of a community does also bring great power in terms of your understanding of that community and the people in it. You know, even as Michelle says, going and engaging with a new member, that network also brings you power as a member of the community. So I do always like the classic Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. One thing I hear a lot of is basically people, not a lot of, but there are people who say, okay, well, I'm going to engage and I'm going to figure out what everyone's doing. And then I'm going to use that as a tool of gossip, or I'm going to use that to, you know, my power of engagement and understanding in my leadership position, et cetera. So I do want to point out that while it's important to be observant, it's also important, once you make that commitment to being engaged and observant, to also commit to not using those things negatively. Don't be the person people need to intervene against. You know, gossip is a form of harm. So even though there is great awareness, the responsibility part is to use that information powerfully. And I think the second step there from just kind of the general idea of having to take responsibility is to look at those tactics. I want to, quickly review those 5 Ds that are, I think, hollowbacks, if I said that correctly, 5 Ds. I just really love these. And these are the different tactics, and you can take responsibility for doing any of these. And it's not as kind of huge, I think, as people think when they're worrying about this. So we talked about distraction, just making yourself the fool, making yourself the center of attention. No harm in distracting a situation. I was at a cousin's wedding last weekend. My brother and I were talking. I haven't seen my brother in 6 months. And 3 times somebody came up who we didn't know to ask us to take their picture. No harm there. They looked like a jerk, but that distraction could be the same thing. You could literally go up to someone and say, hey, can you take my picture? And that happens all of the time. So no harm there. I think it's easier to take responsibility. Delegate. This is above my pay range, but I know someone should step in, whether that's the authorities or leadership in the organization.
I wanted to comment right here too, is that this year particularly, and I know last year, and I'm going to assume years going up, one of the things that the board of directors talks about is learning and what to do in certain situations. So if you as a member see something going on, your first step delegation may be going and talking to chief operations officer or a member of the production team that you can alert someone on the board of directors, and they can make the decision whether it's something that they can take care of, because we talked about power dynamics. There is something about like the hierarchy of having a board position or having a board member come and say something, all the way to escalating to when they know when to call the authorities, when it is an actual safety issue or even just a huge disruption, verbal assault. Like they can choose and have more education in terms of what the next step of escalation is. And so delegation, you should always feel okay coming to a member of the board of directors, especially at conference, but also, during an event, a community event.
And another great example of awareness there is being aware of the chain of command, whether you're at a JC's event, volunteering, for a nonprofit, or always understanding how that delegation process goes, kind of makes it easy. That's part of the responsibility, I think, of being, an active bystander who's willing to intervene. You could also take responsibility for documenting the situation, simply saying, I'm going to write down what was said. I'm going to have, recording. I think recording oftentimes escalates situations, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but recording isn't writing down or taking notes on your phone, just saying, I observed this happening. And that could be a form of taking responsibility. You could delay. We talked about this already. So going up to the person after the situation, you can take responsibility by comforting them, making sure they're okay, letting them know somebody heard them, things like that. Is also a way to take responsibility in any of those situations. And the one I think most people think we're talking about all of the time is directness, which is also obviously a situation, but that's, challenging and not necessary all of the time. But directness, simply going to a perpetuator and saying, you stop, obviously effective for some people. But I think that's the one most people think of like number one when they're trying to decide how to take personal responsibility. And ultimately, that's one of the more challenging ones to do, when a simple distraction could work just as well. But basically, taking that responsibility for making your community better and learning the tactics of how you can actually deploy that responsibility in a way that's productive and reduces harm.
Excellent. Thank you both. Those are all such good responses. And I realized as you were talking, I didn't formally introduce JCI Michigan and our mission. So just as a quick note, JCI Michigan provides leadership development opportunities that empower young people to create positive change. So we've been embedding that into what we're talking about. And I think that you both made really excellent points. And in terms of being aware of the chain of command, I know as a member of the board, we have shirts and name tags and different things to make it clear. And that's something Michelle also has helped remind us to wear those things so that it's obvious for people who, want to network and learn and know people, but also know who to turn to.
That's one of the importance or the real reason why we have board shirts. Like a lot of times people think that it is a perk of being on the board, but it is what it's really meant to do is to make you noticeable in a crowd so that if you're in the ballroom on Friday night and you need a member of the board of directors, you look for that year's board shirt. And so the green embroidered shirt this year should help you identify someone and they can take it up the chain, even if, you don't necessarily need to find the chief operations officer. Find a green shirt who will find the chief operations officer for you. So.
Yes. Thank you. It's dawning on me in many ways. Like I really appreciate how we're bringing it into this very simple sort of way to approach it. And I'm thinking about the golden rule, treating other people how we would want to be treated, and thinking about that care for someone who is in harm's way or maybe potentially put into an awkward situation, and how helpful it is to have someone just attend to you and see you and be present in a moment like that. And I appreciate how clear that can be as we're talking about it. So the next question that we have is thinking about practicing safety for ourselves and others when intervening. And I know we've been touching on the importance of this, but if either of you have specific ways in which we could think about practicing safety, that would be great.
I think a lot of it comes down to context specific, right? As we kind of mentioned earlier, chances are you're not facing like a violent situation, right? We're talking more about harassment, bullying, these types of things, because that is more prevalent in the situations that we find ourselves in. And so when we talk about safety in that context, we're kind of talking about the direction being now turned to you, right? You're going to be yelled at or bullied, or the harassment's going to start on you, or the gossip. And that can be a scary position, understandably. But this, in my mind, goes back to sort of some of the things that Gabe mentioned earlier in terms of a group, right? Maybe you're not individually going up there, you're grabbing, I see Gabe being bullied. So Linda, I grab you and we both go up there and say, hey, Gabe, there's a problem with, registration bags. Can you come help us in the back? Right. That, or, making a joke or distracting, you're not a singular target at that point. Another tactic that I have used, and I know in this case can also diffuse a situation and distract without it turning back to you, is, I know it sounds strange, but ask the person for help. The person who is doing the harassment or bullying or something like that. I see this a lot more in like a gossip situation or complaining about someone talking behind their back. You say, if you, in JC context, a lot of times it's, criticism on the way they do their job or a task that they didn't complete. Asking you, be like, yeah, this situation has been a problem, documentation has been a problem, do you have anything that could help? Like, I'm seeking out this X, Y, and Z. So now you've turned it about the task, you've given the person a way to help the situation, and you've diffused it about being about the past individual, and you're not defending anybody, or it's very difficult for them to then turn it back to you or your failures or whatever. You've given a mission and you've asked for help. That's been successful in many cases. So I think that there's also, just kind of even backing up more, is the idea of when you're caring for someone else and you're showing empathy, that is also a position of strength, right? And so there is a certain level of resilience that comes, that even if that person is going to talk bad about me or yell about me, I know they're doing it because I'm in defense of someone else, or I'm doing the right thing. It feels way less personal, right? And you know that they're just mad. And so it doesn't have the same safety effect on the person intervening as it does on the person who was targeted in the first place. So again, it's one of those, I think it reduces the amount of fear of stepping in if you recognize that up front. And so you don't get in your own head and stop you from intervening, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Those are
Yeah, I
really
think
good.
that, yeah, sorry, Linda, I was just going to say, I think those are really good points. One thing I want to kind of repeat from what Michelle just said, which I think could have been emphasized more, is that not all of these tactics are done to the target of the harassment, but all can also be applied to the perpetuator. So, making jokes to them, removing them from the situation, all are alternatives to think about as well. Now, in terms of safety, I think Michelle also makes a good point in that we have to distinguish between physical safety and psychological safety. And we have to say that if we assess any threat to physical safety, we have to delegate. And that's just kind of the way it goes. We're not, trained professionals in de-escalating physical violence. So delegate to somebody that can. And if we assess any threat to physical safety, delegation is the way to go. But notice I didn't say avoiding intervention. It's just that delegation is the tactic that we focus on for physical safety. When it comes to psychological safety, I think that Michelle's advice there is really great about kind of understanding the context of the situation and understanding kind of what is the risk that you're taking, right? What is the assessment of the risk that you're actually taking? But I also suggest kind of assessing your motivation, and this is basically to prevent to prevent escalation. So have very targeted motivation that removes as much risk as possible. So my motivation is to get the target out of this room, right? In that case, how can I do that safely? Well, I can say, hey, I need your help, right? No one's going to escalate a situation because you need help, etc. So remember your motivation. Another tactic I think is great, and Michelle introduced this as well, and the ABC list that was going to be sent out, it's be in a group. I like to call it the buddy system. It creates both psychological and physical safety to bring another person with you, bring someone in, even if you just say, hey, follow me. There have been times Michelle and I have been, helping run events. Michelle will come up to me and say, follow me. And I don't ask what, I just kind of follow. So knowing those people where you can go up to them and say, hey, follow me, there's not going to be a question. They're just going to be there for support is super important in terms of planning for these. And the last is don't escalate. I have seen kind of people who reduce the safety of a situation and increase the harm because they escalate. So for example, if someone is, speaking loudly, they come in and yell. Okay, that's going to make the situation worse. That's going to engage the perpetuator in an escalatory fashion. There are people who come and just badmouth the perpetuator. Again, that's escalation. Or they'll pull their phone out to record, which is an implicit threat, which can escalate a situation. So I think just remembering my goal here is de-escalation. It's not, one of the things for people who love those Marvel movies is they, save the day, but in doing that, they've destroyed billions of dollars of buildings and probably killed hundreds of people when they threw their cars at the bad guy and things like that. We don't want to be that when we're doing bystander intervention. We don't want to remove a situation by escalating a separate situation or by creating conflict. So I think it's just important to make sure that we are not making a situation less safe. And because we've already narrowed this down to psychological safety, I think addressing, which we're going to address in a minute, that decision phobia and being confident that you're resilient to the potential psychological harm that may come to you for intervening. Yes, someone may be mad at you. We're going to talk about working through that. Yes, this may be a mistake. We'll talk about working through that. But once you've isolated the type of safety that we're talking about, I think it's easy to think of those tactics as solutions to de-escalating those potential harms.
And I think that there's also something to be said about combining tactics. And this just came to me right now is, a lot of times we talk about, finding the person, the victim, right, and removing them from the situation in which they're getting yelled at. In some cases, that is not going to be your best strategy, right? And when I'm thinking of, for an example, and this happens in JC life all the time, is that someone comes up to a table and they're mad and they start yelling. I don't care if it's the registration table, a sign up, a membership table, a patron at an event wants to complain that, that they thought that they should have gotten 6 tickets and their book only had 5, right? Like, it doesn't matter. People are going to people, and sometimes they yell, right? In many of our examples, we would talk about the person getting yelled at, removing them from the situation. In this case, it may not be, but you can understand that there is a certain level of power dynamic, delegate someone from a higher position of authority, a board member or something like that, to remove the person who's yelling. I see that you're upset. Do you want to walk over here and we can get it figured out? Because that in many cases de-escalates the situation because they no longer have an audience, right? They're blustering, and it's yelling at a nameless person behind a registration desk for some reason is easier than when person introduces themselves. Hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm a board member. I see that you're upset about this. Can we talk it out? In many cases that you can solve the issue, de-escalate, and you have protected, the member behind the table who was getting yelled at in the first place, right? That's a combination of different things, but it goes back to that assessment of the situation, kind of getting an idea of maybe the dynamics that are happening, and then deploying tactics that can de-escalate that situation there. Then afterwards, you can go to your member and say, I'm sorry that happened to you. Do you need to take a walk for a second? That wasn't really fair. I understand. If you need my help again, just let me know, signal me, and check on them. And that's really that showing of the care, and sort of, I guess it's in the same category as delaying, but it goes along with, right? So.
That's so helpful. I really appreciate, Michelle, and Gabe, you following up with these examples of how to engage someone who is perpetuating harm or disrupting and disturbing, because I often have found that they're looking for something. So to engage them in any way can really help, like you've both outlined, just de-escalate the situation. I think you gave great examples. The next question that we have is regarding any tips to overcome fear and distress when intervening. I think we've been talking a lot about the fact that this can be really hard, and ways to build confidence and those tactics that can be very effective. But if there are any other things you can think of when facing a fear or feeling maybe someone who's listening has never encountered anything like this, but they want to be equipped, just additional things that they could do to help decrease their fear or distress.
Yeah, so I think this is the right place to talk about overcoming that decision phobia. So a lot of the fear is because we're not thinking about this. We're not planning to have to intervene, and we're relying on the worst time to make a decision, which is a moment of crisis. Whether that crisis be interpersonal or existential, they're never the right places to make decisions. So essentially, the suggestion to overcome that fear is to make the decision beforehand. And what I mean by that is, Linda, you brought a term up in our conversations about this discussion of upstanders. And I think that's a good kind of a theme to think about here, is not just being a bystander and then intervening, but committing to that intervention as necessary as a philosophy, as a morality, as an approach to life, as something that you've thought about and considered and decided, yes, I am committed to creating positive change in my community. Therefore, I am committed to being a bystander intervention when necessary. So essentially, the idea that this isn't an in the moment decision, this is something that you've thought about and kind of come to that decision. So once you commit to being that kind of upstander or active bystander, then it just becomes about creating a method of making that decision and feel confident in it. So one thing I think would be great, and this is Michelle mentioned this almost at the very beginning of our conversation, is a pro-cons list. So just go through the different situations and say, okay, what if I intervene with a distraction and it's not necessary? What are the pros? Well, I've established with everyone in this group that I'm a community builder. I've established that this is a safe space for that community. I've done all of these things. What are the cons? I might be embarrassed, you know, and then kind of keep through that. Well, what if I distract and it is important? Okay, here are the pros. I've removed someone from this situation, etc. The cons, I might have made the perpetuator mad. Just a pro and con list of every situation, kind of every permutation of those situations. What's my tactic, and what was it necessary, or did I misjudge that situation? And ultimately, you'll see exactly what Michelle has already outlined, which is when you put together those pros and cons, there's very few cons to making a mistake as long as your tactic is aligned with safety. So I think that making that decision and being committed to that decision, understanding, hey, I've gone through all these scenarios, I've made pro-con lists, and I'm worrying about nothing, even if I misread the situation, there's no con. Whereas if I'm correct about this, the con list is pretty big for me making the decision not to intervene. And I do want to repeat that idea as well, the decision not to intervene, because a lot of times we talk about bystander intervention and the only thing that we think is making a decision is deciding to intervene. But in reality, if you see something that in your gut isn't right and you don't intervene, you're also making a decision. So inaction is not a replacement for decision making. It's just making a different decision. So when we're talking about overcoming that decision phobia, it's important to understand that really what decision phobia is just not wanting to make the right decision, because the inverse of that decision is still a decision. So I think those kind of things, that pro-con list, knowing your range of options, and also something silly. I know a lot of people, it's just kind of a fear of improv. So basically, if I'm going into this situation, what am I going to do? Prepare that. Have some dumb jokes that you can tell, that you can walk into a situation and just say, have a story you can tell, and be prepared to have an irrelevant distraction. So you just kind of can intervene, distract, and de-escalate with some kind of prepared pieces if you're afraid of small talk, or if you're afraid of that actual distraction. If that's what's stopping you, you can prepare for that as well.
Yeah. One thing I'll add, and it just occurred to me while we're talking about this as well, is that there's also lower stakes ways of intervening if you are feeling very uncomfortable, especially like I know that, as funny as this sounds, it is very difficult for me to go start a conversation with someone that I don't know, perhaps, and stuff like that. However, with the exception of maybe Saturday night when everyone's wearing evening gowns and tuxedos, chances are they have this at some point. And you see somebody having a disagreement or somebody in their face, their phone is usually in front of them. Take a step away so you aren't obvious, like next to them, and call them, or send them a text message that says, hey, this is an emergency, I need your help real quick, call me. That's an excuse for the person to be like, I have to take this and walk away from a situation. And in some cases can be easier for people than stepping in. Now, it won't always work, but that could be a good way to have a distraction and intervene for those that may have more difficulty in person intervening.
I think that that's awesome because it really is a practice. It's something that you've become accustomed to, something that you're committed to. So a low entry barrier is very smart for getting over that fear. It's like you get over a lot of fears. You start with little bits and kind of integrate it interactions. So yeah, for example, maybe when you're starting to make that commitment to bystander intervention, you're delegating to your friends, you're delegating to leadership, but you're at least making that commitment like, hey, I'm not the best person to, maybe there is a power dynamic. Maybe the perpetuator has a power dynamic over you, so you're not the best person to distract. Maybe they'll just push you away because this person's kind of a jerk. So you say, okay, I can delegate this to someone who doesn't have that power dynamic and say, hey, I'm feeling uncomfortable. Can you come help me? And then you've also engaged the buddy system, a great example of what Michelle was saying again about how these tactics can intersect in really productive ways. But basically understand where you're at. I think it's unreasonable to expect that. I mean, I'll distract anybody. I would distract if there was a president of the globe, I would distract them with no problem, but it's unrealistic for me to expect that everyone will have that comfort level. I have no problem making myself a fool in front of a large group of people. I'm a theater kid. I did comedic stuff. I love it. I don't mind if people laugh at me. It's not realistic for me to expect that everyone is willing to do that. If I knew some form of martial arts where I could disarm any person, I would feel comfortable disarming someone in a physical situation. It's not reasonable for me to expect everyone to do that. So a lot of overcoming your fears is knowing your strengths. What of these tactics am I good at? Am I well connected? Am I funny? Do I have no, shame? Do I, can I physically step in between people and can that de-escalate a situation? So a lot of overcoming the fear is recognizing that everyone has strengths that can help. Even if your strength is, I have everybody's phone number, as Michelle talked about. That could be a strength that you can call anybody at any time. Or even if your strength is, I know every member of the board and exactly what they do. That could be your strength as well. So overcoming the fears and assessing where your strengths are and leaning into those, and then developing those other tactics as skills in the future once you understand kind of the impact and value of intervening in harmful situations.
That is excellent. I really appreciate how generative this conversation has been, all of the creative approaches and thinking through things. I have learned a lot. I'm really excited about how this can help other people. And those were all of the questions that I had. Are there any other things either of you would like to make sure we include in this discussion?
Yeah,
And also,
yeah.
just a brief note that we've mentioned there are resources that we've gathered, and so we'll be sharing those, and we can continue to add to that as well.
Yeah. I just wanted to thank both of you for coming on and actually, pushing to have this conversation again, speaking from, the perspective of the board of directors is that, this is a very important conversation because although, there may be board members on site at events or, at a conference or something, in many cases, you task focused, you have things that get done, you're running a conference, right? And so having more of our members be up on this topic to understand and to be aware helps us, because you can't be everywhere. You can't be watching everything. And, one of the most important things is making our members feel welcome and feeling safe. And so if everyone is moving in that direction, if everyone has that sort of knowledge and perspective and is keeping an awareness and making sure that welcome and care comes from everyone and it's not just the responsibility of a certain group of people, I think that strengthens our organization. And it's something that we appreciate from the board to all of our members if we could do that. So thank you for bringing that knowledge and having such an important conversation for everyone.
Absolutely. I want to thank Gabe in particular, being in this role, being able to talk with you at the beginning of the year. And I'm almost certain this was your idea wholeheartedly. And I know it's based on work that you have done together. If not, it was a combination of the three of us talking. And I appreciate both of you for taking the time out to have the discussion as well.
Sure. And I'd like to kind of summarize saying thank you again. This is an area that I think is incredibly important for the organization and for DE&I in particular. I think these discussions are the most productive discussions that we can have, because ultimately when we're talking about bystander intervention, we're talking about creating a better community. And bystander intervention and people who are committed to that as a lifestyle are force magnifiers in improving our community. Every time that we talk about this, every individual who starts to think through the tactics of bystander intervention has an enormous impact on the inclusivity of our community. And just knowing that there are people there who are concerned about inclusivity and creating a productive, safe, and fair community is an incredible force for an organization. So I'm so proud of JCI Michigan, and so proud of both of you all for continuing this conversation and being dedicated to it. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Absolutely. So we will stop the recording.